The unthinkable tragedy that devastated an entire family. True crime documentary. Hook. A family torn apart by a chilling force, darkness that no one could escape. But when the terror reached its peak, the true horror was revealed. What happens when the line between life and death fades away? Stay tuned to discover the shocking twist that will leave you breathless until the very last second. The house stood silent, too silent. A cold breeze whispered through the cracked window, making the old house groan. Creak, creak. The floorboards shifted under the weight of something unseen. Maggie's breath hitched in the dim light of the hallway. Her eyes scanned the empty room, the air thick with tension. Every step she took echoed. Her heart raced, panic creeping up her spine. The house seemed alive tonight. Every creak, every groan seemed like a warning. Her fingers tightened around the railing. She tried to steady her breathing, but it felt impossible. The house was always quiet at night. Too quiet. Her family was asleep, or so she thought. Something was wrong. The silence felt unnatural. A sudden, sharp noise from upstairs made her freeze. Her heart skipped a beat. Maggie swallowed hard. Trembling, she forced her feet to move. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her head screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't. The stairs creaked beneath her as she ascended. The air grew colder. At the top of the stairs, she hesitated. The hallway was shrouded in darkness. She reached for the light switch, but something stopped her. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. Her body screamed for her to run, but she stood still. The house was suffocating her. Then a sound. Soft. Faint. A whisper. Help. The word barely audible. Maggie's skin crawled. She turned toward the source. The door at the end of the hall. Half open. Her pulse thundering in her ears. Slowly, cautiously, she walked toward it. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside was nothing but darkness. Then the faintest glimmer of light. Someone was in there. Her hand reached for the doorknob. It felt freezing cold. With one final breath, she stepped inside. The room was dark, but the air stale, heavy. Her senses tingled. A faint smell of something burning. The floor was cold under her feet. The light flickered above her head. She could hear it now. A low, rhythmic sound. A heartbeat? No, it was something else. Her eyes strained to make out shapes. She could see outlines, figures in the shadows. They were moving, slowly. Her heart slammed against her chest. Maggie. The whisper again. This time louder. A voice, but not quite human. It chilled her to the bone. She stepped forward, closer to the figures. Her foot caught on something, a sharp pull at her ankle. She gasped. A cold hand gripped her. She yanked it away, but it tightened. The figures were real. They were staring at her now, their eyes empty, void of life. A gasp escaped her lips. The room felt smaller, constricting. The shadows swirled, closing in. Her breath quickened. She spun, desperate to escape, but the door was gone. It had vanished. The figures moved closer, slowly, each step in sync, their eyes never leaving hers. She backed up, but there was nowhere to go. The air was suffocating. A sudden coldness enveloped her. Her body stiffened. The whisper came again. Maggie. But this time it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus. Low, haunting, like 1,000 whispers. She felt something touch her shoulder. Frozen in place. Her skin crawled. Her heart hammered. She spun around, nothing there. But then a figure appeared before her. Tall, thin. A face she knew. Her mother. But it wasn't her mother. The eyes empty. Lifeless. Her lips parted. Maggie, it's too late. The words barely reached her ears. And then everything went dark. The darkness consumed her. Maggie couldn't breathe, couldn't see. The world spun around her in chaotic blackness. Her legs gave way. She crumpled to the floor. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears. But it was different now. It wasn't just her own heartbeat. It was a symphony of hearts, a thumping, rhythmic pounding, all around her. She gasped for air, but it felt like the air was made of stone, her chest tight, her limbs numb. Then a voice, soft, clear. "Don't fight it." Maggie's pulse quickened. She recognized the voice. It was her father, but not his voice. This was twisted, distorted. Something wrong. Her hands shot out, searching the air. Her fingers grazed something cold, slick. She recoiled. Something was there. Something alive. The whispers began again. Louder now. Maggie. They surrounded her, suffocating her. The world began to shift, bend. Figures materialized from the shadows. Maggie's mother, father, brother. They all stood before her, but they weren't the same. Their faces pale, sunken. Their eyes empty, hollow. Maggie couldn't scream, couldn't move. Her breath was shallow, strained. The cold was unbearable now. She felt a hand on her arm, frozen. Then a voice, right beside her ear. "Time runs out for all of us." Her eyes snapped open, but everything was the same. The shadows, the cold, the figures staring. Then slowly the room began to shift again. The walls crumbled away. The figures dissolved into darkness. But one stayed, her brother, his face twisted in agony. "Maggie, you have to wake up." The words tore through her, splitting the silence. She reached for him, but his hand slipped away. Maggie, and then nothing. The room was gone. The darkness was gone, and the world was still. Her heart stopped, but something lingered, something worse. Maggie was alone. Again, the silence was suffocating. Maggie tried to move, but her limbs wouldn't obey. Her body felt heavy, as though it had been chained to the ground. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The world was dark, absolute darkness, stretching endlessly. Her breath was ragged. A faint buzzing filled her ears. Then, like a distant whisper, she heard something. A voice. It was so faint, she wasn't sure if it was real, but it was there. Maggie, her name, soft and broken. A shiver ran down her spine. Her eyes darted around, searching. There was nothing. Nothing except the darkness. Then movement. Something shifted in the black void, a blur against the emptiness. Her heart skipped a beat. It was her family again, but they were far away, far too far. Their faces contorted, twisted, their bodies frozen in place like mannequins, but their eyes locked on her, empty, hollow, eyes that seemed to pierce her soul. "Maggie," they whispered in unison, their voices blending together. A chill ran through her veins. She tried to scream, to run, to do anything, but she was paralyzed, frozen. The space around her began to close in. The darkness pressed against her chest, the weight of it suffocating. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through her bones. It was coming from the figures. The hum grew louder, sharper. The darkness itself seemed to pulse with it. "Maggie." The whisper grew louder, more urgent. Closer. Something was wrong. Something ancient, something powerful was here. Her vision blurred. She tried to move, to escape, but her feet remained rooted in place. Suddenly, the figures stepped forward, moving as one. Slowly, the hum intensified, vibrating the ground beneath her. She felt herself falling, though she wasn't moving. The ground was slipping away from her. The figures reached out, their cold, lifeless hands. One of them touched her arm. A surge of icy pain shot through her body. She gasped. The pain burned through her like fire and ice. Her vision fractured. The darkness cracked, splitting into shards. And for the first time since she'd entered this nightmare, Maggie screamed. Her scream echoed through the void. It felt like it tore through her very soul. But no one answered. The figures didn't flinch. They just stood there unmoving, their hollow eyes fixed on her. The pain in her arm burned, spreading through her chest. Her body shook violently. The darkness around her seemed to pulse with each tremor. Maggie's breaths were ragged, frantic. She tried to pull away from the figure's touch, but its hand was unyielding, cold as ice. The world around her warped, bending. The shadows seemed to grow longer, thicker, wrapping around her, suffocating her. The hum louder now. It was almost deafening. The space around her twisted, like a sickening kaleidoscope. The ground beneath her feet crumbled, disappeared. Her body lurched forward as if being pulled by an invisible force. She stumbled, but there was no ground to catch her. She was falling into nothingness. But the figures were still there, their eyes, endless pits of darkness, staring. They followed her descent. The ground returned with a sickening jolt. Maggie landed hard, gasping for breath, but there was no relief. The figures were there, standing above her. Maggie. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't a chorus. It was just one voice, her mother's voice, soft, tender. Maggie, you've been lost for so long. Her breath hitched. The voice, it sounded so real, so familiar. Maggie, come home. Her mother's hand reached down toward her. Maggie's body trembled. She reached for it. Her fingers brushed against her mother's hand. But as soon as their skin touched, a jolt of pain shot through her. Her mother's face, it changed. The skin split, peeling away, revealing something dark, something wrong. Her mother's smile twisted into something hideous. Maggie, come home. But it wasn't her mother anymore. It was the thing inside her, the thing that had been waiting, the thing that had been pulling her deeper into the dark. Her heart raced. Her vision blurred. Everything started to spin. The last thing Maggie saw before the world collapsed into pure blackness was her family, watching her, staring, unblinking, silent. The silence was deafening. Maggie couldn't move, couldn't speak. The blackness pressed in on her, suffocating, unyielding. The air felt thick, suffused with something foul. Her mind spun in circles, grasping for anything solid. But there was nothing, no ground beneath her feet, no walls, no doors, just the endless dark and the empty eyes of her family. Her breath caught in her throat. Her chest tightened. A sensation washed over her. Cold, icy, familiar. A voice, clear and sharp, cut through the silence. Maggie. It was her father's voice, but it was different, harsh, cold. A whisper that crawled beneath her skin. The darkness seemed to move with it, swirling, as if it had a life of its own. The shadows crept closer, surrounding her. Maggie. The voice came again, this time accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps. The floor beneath her feet shifted. It was real now. The ground beneath her feet was solid. The figures of her family were gone. The room, no, the space was different now. Maggie blinked, trying to focus. She was in a place, but not really. The air was thick with decay. The walls, they seemed to pulse, breathing in time with her own heartbeat. Something was watching her. Something was always watching her. She tried to move, but her legs wouldn't respond. Her body was frozen. Her mind screamed. But it was as though the room, the very air, had locked her in place. The floor beneath her was cracked, splitting open. A deep, endless black hole yawned before her. She tried to step back, but her feet wouldn't obey. Maggie. It came again. Her mother's voice. It was coming from the hole. Her gaze was drawn to it. She could feel it calling her, could feel it pulling her in. The edges of the hole were jagged, torn apart like something had clawed at it. A faint, metallic smell lingered in the air. A twisted shape began to form within the void. At first, it was just a shadow, but it grew and grew until Maggie could make out the shape of a figure. It was her brother, his face pale and hollow, his eyes wide open but unseeing. "Maggie," he whispered again, his voice barely a breath. The darkness around her seemed to pulse in rhythm with his words. She felt her body move, though she didn't command it. Her feet took one step forward, then another. Closer, closer, and then everything stopped. The hole, it was right in front of her. She could see the depths now. The blackness seemed alive. It was alive. Maggie, her brother's voice, faint, desperate, came again. "Please help." The hole was a mouth, hungry and endless, and Maggie was falling into it. Maggie's heart slammed against her chest as the darkness loomed closer, its pull magnetic, irresistible. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick with a cold, damp pressure that filled her lungs. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the edges of the void. The edges felt wrong, like they were alive. The shadows around her seemed to shift, wrapping around her wrists, pulling her closer to the edge. "Maggie," her brother's voice echoed, but it wasn't just his anymore. It was everyone, her family, their voices blending together, a chorus of whispers. "Maggie, Maggie." Her name stretched out like a scream in the void. The sound of her family's voices tugged at her heart, but it only made the darkness tighten its grip. She tried to pull back, but her legs wouldn't move. Her body felt frozen, trapped in place. She couldn't breathe. Her vision was clouding over with the deep, oppressive blackness. Then movement. The figure of her brother stepped from the hole, emerging into the dim light. His face was the same, pale, hollow, empty eyes staring into hers. But his body was wrong, twisted, like something had bent him out of shape, pulling his limbs in unnatural angles. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a rasping breath. Maggie's hands shook. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but her voice was lost in the endless dark. The shadow of her brother grew larger as he moved toward her. Closer, closer. "Maggie." His voice sounded strangled now, distorted, as if something was choking it out. She could feel it, the force pulling him, the force pulling them all. The darkness wasn't just around her now. It was inside her, sinking deep into her bones. She tried to turn, tried to escape, but the void closed in on her, consuming her, dragging her closer to the edge of the hole. The whispers were louder now. The figures in the dark, her family, were all there, staring, watching, waiting. Maggie's body trembled, and her knees buckled beneath her. The last of her strength left her as she fell forward. Her hands reached out in desperation, but there was nothing. The hole stretched wider. It swallowed everything, her family, her screams, the endless darkness. And then, nothing. The world was still, silent. Maggie felt weightless, her body suspended in a void where nothing existed. No sound, no light, no air, just an endless blackness. Her thoughts were disjointed, fragments of memories that slipped away before she could grasp them. She didn't know how long she had been floating, if time even existed here. Her limbs felt numb, heavy. The darkness pressed in from all sides. It was suffocating, yet strangely comforting. For a moment, she wondered if she had escaped the torment, the fear, the endless chase. But then a flicker of light. It was distant, far off in the void, a faint glimmer that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and it was moving toward her, closer, closer. Maggie's eyes strained, her body tense with anticipation. The light grew brighter, sharper, and then a figure, a silhouette, standing in the center of the light. It was her mother, but not the mother she remembered. Her mother's face was pale, like porcelain, cracked in places. Her eyes were wide, lifeless, unblinking. Maggie, her mother's voice came through, but it was no longer a whisper. It was a command. "Maggie, come to me." The words pulled at Maggie, like strings on her soul. The light around her flickered, then intensified, casting long shadows on the walls of the void. Her mother's outstretched hand beckoned, but there was something wrong about it. The fingers were too long, twisted, like they didn't belong. Maggie's chest tightened. A cold dread spread through her veins. Her legs, though weak, forced her to take a step toward the figure. It was like a magnet, drawing her in, a force too powerful to resist. With each step, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier. Her breath came in shallow gasps, fogging in the frigid air. "Maggie, come home." Her mother's voice echoed again, but this time it wasn't her voice. It was distorted, twisted. The figure in the light started to change. The features shifted, warped, like clay melting under intense heat. The face cracked open, revealing blackness underneath. The hands were no longer human. They were gnarled, clawed. The thing that was her mother smiled, no, grinned, and the smile stretched unnaturally wide. It wasn't her mother at all. It was something else, something worse. Maggie. The voice was no longer familiar. It was the voice of the darkness itself. Maggie. And then the light went out, the light vanished in an instant, plunging her back into the suffocating blackness. Her heart raced, her mind spinning with terror. She stumbled, disoriented, as the world around her seemed to shift once more. The air felt thick and wrong, pressing against her skin like the weight of 1,000 unseen hands. She tried to breathe, but her lungs felt crushed, as if the darkness itself was suffocating her. Her legs shook beneath her, weak, trembling. Her senses screamed that she was no longer alone. A presence, a weight in the air, something ancient, something hungry. The whispering started again. It wasn't a voice anymore. It was a chorus, many voices, layered on top of each other, merging into one constant, grinding hum. Maggie. The name rang out in the blackness, echoing, rebounding off the unseen walls. Her skin crawled. She turned, but there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive void. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, cracking open with a deep, resonating rumble. From the cracks, something began to rise. A shape, a figure. The air shifted as it moved, warping the space around it. Maggie tried to move, but her legs were frozen, her feet glued to the ground. The figure grew larger and larger. Its shape blurred at first, but then it became clear. It was her family, all of them, her mother, father, and brother. But they weren't the same. Their bodies were twisted, deformed, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. Their faces were blank, their eyes empty, like they were lost in a void that Maggie couldn't reach. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just stared. Their eyes pierced her soul. Maggie couldn't look away. She felt their gaze weighing on her, drawing her in. The whispers became louder. Their voices no longer sounded like her family. They were guttural, alien, full of malice. "Maggie, come back." Maggie. Her body lurched forward, the pull of their voices too strong. Her legs moved on their own. She couldn't stop. Maggie. The ground beneath her feet cracked again, wider this time, and she stumbled. Her arms shot out to steady herself, but there was no ground, no safety. The void yawned beneath her, swallowing her whole. Maggie. Her name one last time, but this time it was different. It was a scream that tore through her mind. And then there was nothing. Only darkness, a vast, endless emptiness. Maggie was lost, the darkness stretched on infinite. Maggie couldn't feel her body anymore. No sense of time or space. Her mind was a blur of fragmented images, whispers, and distorted memories. Her family, was it really them? They seemed to haunt her, their twisted forms locked in her mind, always watching, always waiting. The whispers never stopped. Maggie, come back. The voices were haunting, suffocating. They filled the space, vibrating in her chest, in her very bones. The pull was so strong, her soul ached with it. She wanted to resist. She needed to fight, but there was nowhere to run, nothing to grasp, no way to escape the endless void. Suddenly, the blackness trembled. A flicker of light appeared far in the distance, like the tiniest spark in the vast expanse of nothing. It grew, a dim, glowing shape. Maggie felt herself drawn to it. Her mind screamed in panic, but her body moved forward, almost against her will. The light pulsed with an eerie glow, steady and inviting. Maggie, her name again, a voice that wasn't her family's, but something else. Something older, more powerful, something that knew her. The closer she got to the light, the colder the air became. It wrapped around her, biting into her skin. The light flickered again, and with it, the shape grew clearer. A figure, tall, almost towering. It had no face, but Maggie felt its presence, felt its gaze. It was waiting for her. Maggie, the voice repeated, but now it sounded distorted. A broken echo of the past. The figure's form shifted, like smoke, like shadow. It reached out, its hand stretching toward her. She couldn't move, frozen in place, her breath shallow, her heart racing. The hand came closer, impossibly close, and then it touched her, cold, colder than anything she'd ever felt before. Her body jerked, a violent shock of ice running through her. The pain, sharp and intense, ripped through her chest, spreading out from the point where the hand had made contact. Her vision blurred, flickered, and then a piercing sound, like the snap of bones. The world cracked open. Everything shattered. Her screams, lost in the void, the shattering sound echoed, reverberating through every fiber of her being. Maggie gasped, her body jerking as if it were being torn apart. Her chest burned with the coldness, as though ice had invaded her very soul. She tried to scream, but the pain was too overwhelming, suffocating her voice before it could escape. Her limbs were paralyzed, locked in place as the figure's presence pressed closer. The figure's hand, no longer just a hand, began to transform, elongating, twisting like something unnatural, a dark tendril reaching into the void. Her mind was spinning, dizzy, lost in the twisting maze of her senses. Everything around her was bending, warping. The cold that had invaded her body now felt like it was reaching deeper, filling her veins, freezing her very essence. The figure moved again. Its outline flickered like a broken light bulb, and suddenly it was right in front of her. Closer, closer still. Maggie couldn't escape. She couldn't move, and then she felt it. A pressure against her chest, the coldness seeping deeper into her bones. The figure was inside her. Maggie's heart thundered in her chest, her breathing quick and shallow, but the darkness swallowed everything. The coldness was everywhere now, inside her, around her. She was drowning in it. The figure's voice spoke again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. Maggie, you belong here. The words reverberated through her mind, hollow and final. The cold hand pressed down further, and Maggie felt herself slipping, falling, spiraling into the abyss. Her vision blurred, her body fading, her thoughts scattering like broken fragments. The last thing she saw was the figure's form, its shape now fully clear, a monstrous silhouette, impossibly tall, eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The eyes were empty, hollow, like the void itself. And in that emptiness, Maggie understood. She had never been meant to escape. The darkness wasn't something she could run from. It was inside her, always had been, and now she was part of it. The void closed in, consuming her entirely. And then there was nothing. Just darkness. Endless. Infinite. All-encompassing. And in that darkness, Maggie's final scream faded, swallowed whole by the void. There was no one left to hear it, and then silence. A deep, oppressive silence that swallowed everything. Every thought, every memory, every trace of Maggie's existence. She was no longer sure if she even existed. The darkness had consumed her entirely, and there was nothing left to grasp. Time itself had ceased to matter. She could no longer feel her body. No pulse, no breath. Just an endless void stretching in all directions. And yet, something stirred in the stillness. A flicker of awareness. A pulse. A sensation. The void wasn't truly empty. There's something moving within it. Something ancient. Something alive. And then she felt it. A tug. A pull. A voice. But this voice wasn't hers. It wasn't her family's. It was a deep, resonating voice, far older than anything Maggie had ever known. Maggie. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a command, a forceful presence, pressing against her. The dark shape from before seemed to flicker back into her awareness. Only this time, it wasn't just a silhouette. It was something more than just a shape. Maggie didn't understand it, but she could feel it. It was calling her, pulling her in. And despite everything, despite the cold, the darkness, the suffocating weight of it all, Maggie felt something else, too. A shift. Something moving deep inside her. A strange force, as if something that had been dormant for so long was waking up. Her senses flickered, igniting slowly, painfully. The darkness wasn't as absolute as it once was. Maggie could see the faintest outline, like a thread of light barely visible in the blackness. She reached for it. Her hand, though she still couldn't feel it, reached out, driven by some impulse she didn't fully understand. The darkness pressed harder against her, fighting her. But the light, that asterisk flicker, was stronger. It was a part of her, and she was a part of it. As her fingers neared the thread of light, the air around her shifted again. The figure, the presence, seemed to move, trying to stop her. But Maggie was beyond fear now. She had no choice but to follow the light. Her heart, though silent, beat with purpose. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Maggie felt alive. The pull of the darkness seemed to weaken. She stretched her hand farther, closer, and then with a sudden, violent force, everything shattered again, everything shattered. The darkness cracked open, splintering like glass, and the cold that had suffocated her for so long vanished in an instant. The light exploded outward, blinding, pure. Maggie gasped, a sharp intake of air that felt like the first breath she'd taken in forever. Her body was weightless, suspended in an ocean of light. For a moment, she couldn't see, couldn't hear, but she could feel. The air around her felt different, warm, alive, real. Her skin tingled, her senses returning, one by one. The light faded slowly, retreating, allowing her to focus. She was no longer in the void. The oppressive, suffocating blackness was gone. She was somewhere else. The ground beneath her was solid, warm. Maggie blinked, her eyes adjusting to the soft light around her. She was standing in the middle of a small, open space. It was unfamiliar, but comforting, like the feeling of home. The air smelled fresh, clean, like rain. The ground beneath her feet was covered in soft grass, lush and green. She could feel the coolness of it against her skin as she took a tentative step forward. But everything felt wrong. The air was still, Yet there was an undercurrent of tension, like something was lurking just beyond her reach. Her heart began to race again, a dull ache in her chest, as a sense of dread slowly crept back in. There was something about this place that didn't feel right. Maggie tried to move, but her legs were heavy, as though they were no longer her own. She glanced around, her gaze darting from one shadow to the next. The trees surrounding her were tall and ancient, their branches twisted and gnarled, like something out of a nightmare. The wind was still, not a leaf stirred, but there was a whisper in the air, a voice, not like before, but a subtle, almost imperceptible sound. Maggie, her body tensed, her breath catching in her throat. She knew that voice. It was familiar, her family, but they weren't here. They couldn't be, not in this place. She looked around, frantic, but saw no one. The whisper continued, echoing through her mind, growing louder, more urgent. Maggie, come. Her pulse quickened. The voice was coming from everywhere now. The trees, the ground, the sky. It was all around her, and it was calling her. Maggie. With a sudden, jarring clarity, she realized something. Asterisk, she wasn't a lone star. The presence was still here. The force that had drawn her into the void. It had followed her. It never let her go. And now it was waiting. Maggie took a shaky step back, her eyes scanning the darkness between the trees. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it. Asterisk watching star. A sound rippled through the still air. A movement. A shadow. No, multiple shadows. They were closing in, and she realized with a growing terror that the thing she had escaped was not gone. It had just changed, and now it was more powerful than ever. The air grew colder. The ground beneath her feet began to shift. Maggie turned, but there was nowhere to run, nothing to hold on to. The whisper came again, louder this time, and she understood in that moment. There was no escaping it. The shadows grew closer, swirling like a dark storm gathering strength. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a frantic echo in the oppressive silence. The figures, unseen, yet felt, were closing in on her. She could feel their presence surrounding her, suffocating her, inch by inch. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs were frozen, rooted to the ground. The voice came again, sharp and commanding. Maggie. It was familiar, but it wasn't her family anymore. It was the force, the thing that had followed her. Her mind screamed for escape, but it was useless. The darkness was inevitable, and there was nowhere to hide. Her hands shook as they reached out, trying to touch something, anything. But everything was cold, distant, unreachable. And then she saw it. In the center of the clearing, where the shadows pooled thickest, a figure emerged. At first, it was just a silhouette, dark and shapeless, but as it stepped forward, the shape became clearer. It was her mother, but not like she remembered. Her mother's face was contorted, her eyes wide and hollow, her skin stretched tight over a skull that seemed too small for her. Maggie, her voice echoed again, a distorted mockery of the love it once held. Maggie staggered back, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Her mother's figure reached out to her with twisted, claw-like hands, and Maggie could feel the pull, the undeniable force drawing her closer. She wanted to resist, but her body was no longer her own. It was like the ground was pulling her toward her. The whispering voices swelled, now all around her, pressing against her mind, sinking into her soul. Maggie, come to us. And she understood. It was never about escape. She was always meant to return. The thing that had been chasing her, the thing that had whispered in the darkness. It had always been inside her, a part of her. Her body trembled, the realization crushing her. Her arms were heavy, her mind fogged with the weight of it. She could feel the darkness wrapping around her, slowly consuming her once again. But This time, she didn't fight it. She surrendered. Her mother's clawed hand reached her, and the moment their fingers touched, everything went black. No sound, no light. Only the void, the darkness that had once felt like a suffocating force now felt strangely still, almost serene. Maggie's mind was heavy, but there was a sense of release, a quiet that settled over her like a blanket. The pull of the shadows had ceased. The relentless chase, the fear, the confusion, it was all gone. There was nothing left to fight. Her body, once stiff with terror, now felt at ease. Her limbs no longer trembled, no longer resisted the inevitable. Maggie opened her eyes, though she wasn't sure what she was expecting to see. The void around her had no shape, no color, just the feeling of an endless expanse that stretched in all directions. But in the stillness, something shifted. A warmth, a faint light, barely noticeable at first, began to grow. Soft and golden, it flickered like the first rays of dawn breaking through a long, dark night. The shadows around her seemed to recoil, fading into the edges of her awareness. Maggie took a tentative breath, feeling something familiar stir deep within her chest, a sense of peace she hadn't known in so long. The warmth continued to spread, filling the space with a gentle radiance. Her mind felt clearer, lighter, as if something heavy had been lifted from her soul. And then she heard it, a voice, soft and comforting, like the whisper of the wind through trees on a quiet autumn afternoon. Maggie, her name, once laced with pain and fear, now carried a tenderness she hadn't imagined possible. Maggie, it's time. The light grew brighter, surrounding her in a soft glow, and she felt something shift once again, a pull, not of darkness, but of calm, of release. It was as though she were being cradled in the arms of something much larger than herself, something timeless. The void was no longer empty. It was full, full of peace, full of understanding. Maggie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything she had endured fade away. And as she let go, as she surrendered completely to the light, she finally understood. There's no end. There was only peace. And in that peace, she was free. The shadows were gone. The darkness had released its hold, and Maggie was at rest. Her journey had come to its final, graceful conclusion.